The frozen window panes offered a view of nothing but a chaotic white expanse. Yet, inside Jacob Veer's cabin, a warm, golden light radiated upwards from the rectangular opening in his floor. What the neighbors had derisively called Veer's foolish hole for the past 8 months was now the only thing that would ensure the survival of 17 people for the next 4 days. But before we continue with the story, let us know where you're watching from. And if frontier survival stories like this intrigue you, be sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode will unveil an innovation even more astonishing than this one. The cabin walls groaned under the relentless assault of the wind, which had been howling without respite for 63 hours. Jacob Werner sat beside the lifeless body of his wife, Anna, wrapped in every blanket they owned, and understood with painful clarity that adhering to conventional wisdom had cost her life. The fire in their stone hearth had burned continuously since the storm's onset, consuming their entire winter wood supply in less than 3 days. The heat rose uselessly up the chimney and dissipated into the unforgiving Wyoming night. The gaps between the cabin logs, chinked with the typical mixture of mud and moss, allowed the wind to penetrate despite Jacob's diligent maintenance efforts. The single window, covered with oiled paper, provided virtually no insulation. The dirt floor radiated cold upwards from the frozen earth below. Everything about their cabin followed the time-honored, unquestioned patterns of frontier construction, built in the same way every settler built. Anna had been healthy just 3 days earlier when the blizzard struck in mid-January of 1847. The temperature plummeted to what Jacob estimated to be minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, perhaps even colder. The howling wind made accurate assessment impossible, but he knew it was the most brutal weather he had experienced in his 4 winters on the frontier. They had huddled close to the fire, burning through wood at an alarming rate. By the second day, he realized their supply would not last. By the third day, the fire had consumed the last log. Without heat, the cabin's interior temperature plummeted rapidly. Anna, already weakened by a lingering cough from earlier in the winter, couldn't maintain her body warmth. She passed away peacefully in the early hours of the 4th day, just as the storm finally began to subside. Jacob sat motionless for hours after her death, not merely from grief, but from a profound realization that was fundamentally altering his understanding of survival. The cabin hadn't failed because it was poorly built. He had constructed it carefully using solid logs, proper notching, and adequate chinking. It had failed because the basic design itself was flawed. Any above-ground structure, no matter how well constructed, was inherently vulnerable to temperature extremes in ways that couldn't be overcome with traditional methods. Heat escaped too easily. Cold penetrated too readily. The wind exacerbated the danger exponentially. He thought about the root cellar he had dug the previous summer to store vegetables. Even in the deepest winter cold, the root cellar never froze. Potatoes and carrots remained perfectly preserved while surface temperatures plunged to lethal levels. The earth itself provided insulation that no amount of logs and chinking could equal. He recalled stories from miners he had met who described working underground in winter, how the tunnels remained warmer than the surface camps. He remembered a neighbor who had built an ice house partially underground, utilizing the earth's insulation to prevent ice from melting even in the summer heat. A question began to form in Jacob's mind, a question that would consume the next 8 months of his life. What if the safest place during a winter storm wasn't an above-ground cabin at all, but rather a properly constructed chamber beneath the earth? Jacob buried Anna on a hillside overlooking their claim. When the ground thawed enough to dig in early March, he marked the grave with stones and returned to the cabin with a renewed sense of purpose, as if momentum was carrying him forward. Most widowers in his position would have left the frontier, returned to family in the east, or relocated to a larger settlement where life was less isolated. But Jacob stayed because he had a problem to solve, and leaving before he solved it felt like abandoning Anna a second time. He spent the spring traveling to nearby settlements and homesteads within a 2-day ride, ostensibly visiting neighbors and assessing how others had weathered the brutal winter. In reality, he was meticulously studying every structure that interacted with the earth, paying keen attention to temperature, moisture, and stability in ways that other men didn't. At the Hartman Trading Post, 15 miles east of his cabin, he spent an afternoon examining Otto Hartman's root cellar. The structure was simple, dug 8 feet into a hillside and lined with fieldstone. Otto stored vegetables, preserved meats, and barrels of goods that required cool, stable temperatures. Jacob requested permission to take measurements and observations. Otto, intrigued by Jacob's intense interest, agreed. The root cellar maintained a temperature of approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of external conditions. In the depths of winter, when surface temperatures plummeted below zero, the cellar remained at 50 degrees. In the summer heat, when surface temperatures soared above 90 degrees, the cellar stayed at 50 degrees. The earth provided insulation superior to any material Jacob could build with. More importantly, the temperature stability was passive, requiring no heating in winter and no cooling in summer. The earth itself did the work. Jacob visited a small mining operation 30 miles north where men extracted silver from a hillside. He persuaded them to allow him to tour the tunnels, claiming an interest in mining techniques. What he truly sought was an understanding of the thermal environment underground. The miners confirmed his suspicions. Even in the coldest months, the tunnels remained comfortably warm. Once you descended past the first 20 feet, men worked in shirt sleeves underground while surface temperatures could freeze exposed skin in minutes. The miners attributed this to body heat and lamp heat, but Jacob recognized that the earth itself was providing the baseline warmth. At a remote homestead, he found a family of Swedish immigrants who had built a partially underground dwelling, something they called a backstuga. The structure had a conventional log cabin front, but the rear half was built into a hillside with earth piled against and over the walls. The family explained that in Sweden, this design was common in regions with harsh winters. They had endured the same blizzard that killed Anna, and while they had been uncomfortable and frightened, they had never been in danger of freezing. Their design, primitive compared to what Jacob was beginning to envision, had kept them alive, using far less firewood than a conventional cabin required. Jacob also sought out an old French trapper named Baptiste, who lived in a hide-covered pit house near a creek. The structure was almost entirely underground, accessed by a ladder through a smoke hole in the roof. Baptiste had lived this way for 12 winters and claimed he burned less wood in a full winter than most settlers burned in a month. The interior was cramped and dark, but undeniably warm. Jacob spent an evening there measuring dimensions and observing construction details while Baptiste regaled him with stories of the fur trade. Each observation added detail to the concept forming in Jacob's mind. Underground spaces maintained stable temperatures. Earth provided superior insulation. Depth below the surface correlated with thermal stability. The challenge wasn't whether an underground space could stay warm, but whether it could be built well enough to serve as a genuine refuge, not just a crude shelter. Jacob returned to his cabin in late April of 1847 with a leather journal filled with sketches and measurements. He spent 2 weeks refining his concept, drawing and redrawing until the design satisfied both his practical requirements and his limited understanding of engineering principles. The underground room would be 10 feet deep, 12 feet wide, and 14 feet long, large enough to shelter multiple people if necessary, but small enough that one man could excavate it alone. The walls would be brick, not stone or earth. Brick would provide structural stability and create a smooth surface that could be easily kept clean. The ceiling would be timber beams supporting the cabin floor above, reinforced to carry the weight of people and furniture. The entrance would be a concealed hatch in the cabin floor, insulated to prevent heat loss. A wooden stairway would provide safe access, replacing the ladder that root cellars typically used. Ventilation would come through a shaft disguised as an extension of his existing chimney, allowing fresh air without creating dangerous drafts. Heat would come from a small iron stove with its own dedicated flue, requiring minimal fuel to maintain comfortable temperatures in the well-insulated space. The design was ambitious for a man working alone, but Jacob believed it was achievable. In early May, he rode to Otto Hartman's trading post with a detailed list of materials. Otto read through the list slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to confusion. 400 bricks, 80 pounds of mortar, 20 linear feet of iron stovepipe, one small iron stove designed for heating, not cooking, 40 square feet of corkboard, iron brackets and hinges, lumber cut to specific dimensions for stairs and framing. Otto set the list down and looked at Jacob directly. "What are you building?" Jacob explained the concept. An underground room beneath his cabin floor, brick-lined, properly ventilated, heated with a small stove, designed to provide refuge during extreme weather when above-ground structures became dangerous. He described the stable temperatures in root cellars and mine tunnels, the physics of earth insulation, and the failure of conventional cabins during the storm that killed Anna. Otto listened without interrupting, then asked practical questions about drainage, structural support, and ventilation. He was a businessman, not an engineer, but he understood construction basics from years of supplying frontier builders. Some of Jacob's answers were confident. Others were admissions that he would solve problems as they arose. Otto calculated costs and delivery timelines. The bricks would need to be hauled from a kiln 40 miles south. The cork would come from St. Louis on the next supply wagon. Total cost would consume most of Jacob's savings. Delivery would take 6 weeks. Jacob agreed to the terms. Otto wrote up the order, then paused before Jacob left. "People are going to think you're crazy," he said quietly. Jacob nodded. He had already accepted that. Otto added the order to his outgoing freight list, and Jacob rode home to begin work that would occupy him until autumn. Word of the unusual order spread through the scattered settlement within days. By the time Jacob started excavating, his project already had a nickname. They called it Werner's Folly. Jacob removed 6 floorboards from the center of his cabin in late May, creating an opening 4 feet wide and 6 feet long. The exposed earth beneath was hard-packed and dry. He began digging with a short-handled spade, filling a wooden bucket, hauling it outside, dumping it, and returning for another load. The process was repetitive and exhausting. Each bucket held approximately 20 pounds of earth. He estimated he would need to remove roughly 12,000 pounds of soil to create the chamber he had designed. The first 2 feet of excavation went quickly. The earth was relatively soft, and Jacob made steady progress. By the end of the first week, he had created a pit 3 feet deep, but as he dug deeper, the work became exponentially harder. At 4 feet down, he was working in a cramped space with limited room to maneuver the shovel. At 6 feet, he needed to climb in and out of the pit using a ladder, carrying each bucket up before dumping it. At 8 feet, the walls began showing signs of instability, with small amounts of earth crumbling and falling. Jacob stopped digging and spent 3 days shoring up the walls with rough timber planks braced against the pit sides. The bracing was temporary, meant only to prevent collapse during excavation, but it was essential. A cave-in would bury him alive, and no one would find his body for days or weeks. He worked carefully, testing each wall section before continuing deeper. Carl Briner visited in mid-June, ostensibly to borrow tools, but clearly curious about the project everyone was discussing. He stood at the edge of the pit and watched Jacob haul bucket after bucket of earth up the ladder. After 20 minutes of silence, Carl finally spoke. "You have been digging for 3 weeks. Jacob dumped another bucket and descended the ladder without responding. Carl continued, louder now. "You could have built an entire cabin in 3 weeks. You could have planted crops. You could have done anything useful. Instead, you are digging a hole." Jacob filled another bucket and climbed up. Carl stepped back to let him pass. "Anna would not have wanted this," Carl said quietly. Jacob stopped, set down the bucket, and looked at Carl directly. "Anna died because our cabin could not protect her. I am building something that will protect anyone who needs it. If you think that is foolish, you are welcome to leave." Carl stared at him for a moment, then walked away without another word. By early July, Jacob had excavated to the full 10-foot depth. The pit measured 12 feet by 14 feet at the bottom, slightly larger at the top to accommodate the sloped walls he had cut to prevent collapse. He had hauled approximately 14,000 pounds of earth out bucket by bucket over 6 weeks. His hands were calloused and bleeding in places despite wrapping them with cloth. His back ached constantly, but the excavation was complete, and the materials Otto had ordered would arrive within the week. The real construction could begin. The freight wagon arrived at Otto Hartmann's trading post in the second week of July. Jacob spent 2 days hauling materials from the post to his cabin using a borrowed horse and cart. The 400 bricks required 8 trips. The iron stove, stovepipe, cork, mortar, and lumber required 3 additional trips. By the time everything was staged near his cabin, Jacob had invested another week into the project. Carl Briner watched one of the hauls pass his homestead and shook his head without speaking. Jacob had never laid brick before. He understood the basic principles of staggered joints and mortar, but he had no practical experience with the craft. He mixed his first batch of mortar according to the instructions Otto had provided, applied it to the bottom course of bricks along one wall, and quickly realized the work required skill he did not possess. The mortar was too wet. The bricks slid out of alignment. The joints were inconsistent. He tore out the first attempt and started again. Friedrich Klein arrived at Jacob's cabin on a July afternoon, traveling through the territory on his way to a carpentry job in Oregon. He was a German immigrant like Jacob, skilled in multiple building trades, including brickwork. Friedrich had heard about Wernern's underground room from Otto and detoured specifically to see it. He climbed down into the excavated pit, examined the dimensions, asked about drainage and ventilation plans, and offered a proposition. He would stay for 2 weeks and teach Jacob proper bricklaying technique in exchange for meals and a place to sleep. Jacob agreed immediately. Friedrich was a methodical teacher. He demonstrated how to mix mortar to the correct consistency, how to apply it evenly, how to set each brick with a slight tapping motion that seated it firmly, while keeping alignment true. He showed Jacob how to use a level and plumb line to ensure the walls stayed straight and vertical. They worked together on the first wall, Friedrich leading while Jacob followed his example. By the 3rd day, Jacob was laying bricks with reasonable confidence. The walls rose slowly. Each course had to cure overnight before adding the next, preventing the weight from squeezing out the wet mortar below. Friedrich and Jacob established a rhythm. Mornings were spent laying brick. Afternoons were spent preparing materials, cutting lumber for the stairway, and planning ventilation details. Friedrich appreciated Jacob's systematic approach and willingness to learn. Jacob absorbed every technique Friedrich demonstrated. By the end of the first week, 3 walls were complete to half height. During the second week, they finished all 4 walls to the full height and began constructing the wooden stairway. Friedrich designed stairs with a comfortable rise and tread depth, including a handrail for safety. The stairs were anchored to the brick wall on one side and supported by posts on the other. When Friedrich departed in early August, the brick walls were complete. The stairway was functional, and Jacob understood enough about masonry and carpentry to finish the remaining work himself. Friedrich refused payment beyond meals, saying the project was worth supporting. He rode west toward Oregon, leaving Jacob to complete what they had started together. Jacob spent August completing the structural elements that would transform an underground pit into a functional refuge. The ceiling required heavy timber beams spanning the width of the chamber, spaced 18 inches apart to support the weight of the cabin floor above. He selected logs 8 inches in diameter, cut them to length, and notched them to rest securely on the brick walls. Each beam weighed approximately 120 pounds. Lifting them into position alone was difficult, requiring a makeshift pulley system he rigged using rope and a beam extended through the cabin doorway above. Once the ceiling beams were installed, he laid floorboards across them, recreating the cabin floor over the underground room. He left the rectangular opening for the hatch, 4 feet by 6 feet, positioned near the center of the cabin where it would be least obvious to casual visitors. The hatch itself required precision carpentry that tested everything Friedrich had taught him. Jacob cut planks from straight-grained pine, each 3 inches thick. He shaped tongue-and-groove joints along the edges so the planks would interlock tightly when assembled. The process was tedious. Each joint had to fit precisely, or the hatch would have gaps that compromised insulation. The assembled hatch weighed nearly 80 pounds but was rigid and gap-free. Jacob mounted it using heavy iron hinges, recessed into both the hatch and the floor frame, allowing the hatch to sit flush when closed. From above, with the hatch closed, it blended almost seamlessly with the surrounding floorboards. Only someone looking carefully would notice the seam. He installed a locking bar on the underside that could be engaged from below, providing security if needed. The cork insulation was the most expensive single component Otto had ordered. Jacob cut it into strips and attached it around the entire perimeter of the hatch frame using small nails and adhesive. The cork created a compressible seal that closed gaps when the hatch was shut, preventing airflow between the cabin and the underground room. The thermal barrier was essential. Without it, warm air from below would escape, and cold air from above would infiltrate, defeating the purpose of the underground design. Ventilation required equal attention. Jacob extended his existing chimney with additional brickwork, creating what appeared to be a taller chimney, but was actually two separate flues within one structure. One flue served the cabin fireplace. The second, smaller flue connected to the underground room, providing fresh air intake. He installed a damper that could be adjusted from below, controlling airflow based on conditions. The system was passive but effective, using natural convection to circulate air. The iron stove was positioned in one corner of the underground room with its own dedicated exhaust flue running up through the cabin wall and exterior. The stove was small, designed for heating rather than cooking, and required minimal fuel. Jacob tested it with a small fire and confirmed the flue drew properly without smoking. By mid-September, the underground room was complete and functional. Jacob began stocking it with supplies, preserved food, water barrels, blankets, medical items, candles, firewood, everything someone might need during an extended refuge. The settlement held an informal gathering in early October at Otto Hartmann's trading post. These gatherings happened several times each year, providing scattered homesteaders an opportunity to trade goods, share information, and maintain the minimal social connections that frontier life allowed. Jacob attended reluctantly, knowing his project would be discussed, but recognizing that isolation served no practical purpose. He arrived in the late afternoon, as perhaps 20 people milled around the trading post yard. Karl Briner saw Jacob immediately and raised his voice to ensure others could hear. Werner finally emerges from his hole. "Tell us, Jacob, how deep did you dig before you realized you were wasting your time?" Several people laughed. Jacob said nothing and moved toward the trading post entrance. Karl followed, encouraged by the audience. 8 months. That is how long you spent digging and building underground. 8 months you could have spent trapping, farming, doing anything productive. Instead, you built a cellar to live in like an animal. Greta Briner, Karl's wife, touched her husband's arm gently, suggesting he stop. Karl shrugged her off. He needs to hear it. Everyone is too polite to say what they think, but someone should tell him the truth. Anna's death affected his judgment. He is not thinking clearly. Jacob turned to face Karl directly. His voice was quiet but carried across the yard. "I am thinking clearly. I built something that will keep people alive when cabins fail. If that seems foolish to you, I hope you never learn otherwise." He walked into the trading post, ending the confrontation. The yard fell silent for a moment before conversations resumed. Inside, Otto was organizing inventory. He glanced at Jacob and gestured toward the back room where they could speak privately. Once away from others, Otto spoke carefully. "Karl is not the only one who thinks your project was excessive. Most people believe you overreacted to tragedy. They respect your loss, but they question your judgment." Jacob nodded. He had expected this. "What do you think?" Otto considered the question. "I think you built something remarkable. The engineering is sound. The materials are quality. The design is innovative. But I also think you may never need it. Storms like the one that killed Anna are rare. You may have invested 8 months preparing for something that will not happen again in your lifetime." He paused. "That does not make it foolish. It makes it cautious. But others will not see the difference." Jacob left the trading post without participating further in the gathering. He rode home under a clear October sky, knowing that his reputation in the settlement had shifted from tragic widower to eccentric recluse. People would remember him as the German who dug a hole and called it innovation. The judgment did not particularly bother him. He had not built the underground room for social approval. He had built it because conventional cabins killed people, and he refused to accept that vulnerability as inevitable. Winter would arrive soon. If the room never proved necessary, he would accept that outcome. But if another storm came, he would be ready. The first snow fell in early November of 1847, light and brief. The second storm arrived a week later and lasted 2 days, leaving 8 inches of accumulation. Neither storm concerned Jacob. They were typical early winter weather, cold but manageable. He maintained his cabin fireplace, checked his supplies, and continued routine work around his homestead. The underground room remained unused, accessible through the hatch, but not yet necessary. The third storm arrived on November 23rd with characteristics that immediately distinguished it from normal winter weather. The temperature dropped 12 degrees Fahrenheit in 2 hours. The wind increased from calm to sustained gale force in less than an hour. Snow began falling so heavily that visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. Jacob was outside splitting firewood. When conditions deteriorated rapidly, he ceased his work, gathered the firewood he had already chopped,